Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Caabu online book launch with Dr. Michael Willis. We're very pleased to be doing an event on Algeria. I think quite timely in a way that it's 60. This evening's Caabu online book launch. Sorry about that. That was my own voice echoing back at me. I think quite timely in a way that it is 6 decades since Algeria's independence in 1962, and we're very pleased that he'll be talking about his book Algeria: Politics and Society from the Dark Decade to the Hirak. Obviously, Michael actually spoke to us at an in-person event back in May 2019. Very happy to have him in an online form as well, and we hope you'll have sort of many questions for him. Please put the questions in the chat, and we will obviously invite you to ask those questions directly to him. Just by way of sort of introduction, Dr. Michael J. Willis is a fellow of the Middle East Centre at St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford, where he has taught modern Maghreb politics since 2004. Algeria: Politics and Society from the Dark Decade to the Hirak is his second book on Algeria. His first was The Islamist Challenge in Algeria, a Political History, published in 1997. He's also the author of Politics and Power in the Maghreb, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, From Independence to the Arab Spring, which came out in 2012. It's a great pleasure to have you, Michael, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and thank you very much to Caabu, especially to Chris Doyle and also to Felicity for inviting me to speak this evening about my new book. Those of you who know Caabu know the great work that they do, and I was therefore very honoured to accept their invitation. As Joe mentioned, I came and spoke about 3.5 years ago, so it's quite nice to have a follow-up event like that. So why have I written a book on Algeria, and why this particular book on Algeria? Well, first of all, why a book on Algeria? Well, I think that Algeria is probably one of the least well-known countries in the Arab world, certainly outside of the region. This is despite the fact that it is geographically the largest member of the Arab League, and it has long had the second largest population, 45 million. I think Sudan may have just overtaken it recently, but it's the only, for many years, it was the largest population, second only really to Egypt. Beyond the Arab world, it's the largest country in Africa, and indeed the 10th largest in the world. But Algeria is not only not small, but it's also not remote or unconnected. It's only 100 miles from Europe. Several million Algerians live in Europe. It has one of the largest armies in Africa. And crucially for current times, it is a significant producer of oil and especially gas. And that's created, makes it suddenly much more significant than perhaps it was. Yet despite these facts, most people outside Algeria know comparatively little about it as a country. Most people are probably aware of Algeria's experiences of French colonialism, notably its long and bloody struggle for independence in the 1950s and 1960s, knowing it through things like the film The Battle of Algiers. But knowledge of the period after independence is often, I think, rather hazy for most people. There is some awareness, I think, that the country experienced a bitter internal conflict in the 1990s. And possibly even that 3 years ago, there were mass demonstrations across the country. But beyond this and how all of this fits together, I don't think is very clear to many people. I'm sure there are many people on this call who are more familiar with that. But I think for most people, Algeria is a rather unknown country. So this was one of the main reasons I wrote this book, was to try and raise awareness and understanding about Algeria. In that sense, it was written mainly for people who aren't familiar with Algeria. So that's why a book on Algeria. So why this particular book on Algeria? Why did I write this one? Well, I wanted to write something on more recent events and developments. I had written my first book and the PhD thesis on what it was based on Algeria, substantially focusing on the 1990s. And I therefore wanted to look at the period since then. And I decided to focus on the last 2 decades. This wasn't primarily because it coincides quite neatly with the first 2 decades of the new millennium, the first 2 decades of the 21st century, but for other reasons, because the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s saw 3 developments in Algeria in the areas of leadership, economy and society that really, in my view, recast the political landscape in the country and made it worth looking at in a fresh way. So what were these 3 things that changed around the turn of the millennium? Well, firstly, and most obviously, but I actually believe probably the least of importance of the 3 things, was the formal election of Abdelaziz Bouteflika to the presidency of Algeria in April 1999. And this was a position he would hold for almost exactly 20 years until his enforced resignation in April 2019. That was the first change. The second change around the turn of the millennium was the perceptible decline in levels of violence that had been a major feature of Algeria in the 1990s. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Algeria had experienced a prolonged and bloody civil conflict in the 1990s between the government and armed Islamist groups following the cancellation and abandonment in 1992 of elections that an Islamist party, the Islamic Salvation Front, had been poised to decisively win. Now, this conflict claimed tens of thousands of lives, but the violence associated with it began to decline towards the end of the 1990s and particularly into the 2000s. The third factor that changed around this time is the third factor that drew me to try and write this book. And I think the most important was the steady climb in the international price of oil that began in the second half of 1999 and continued for well over a decade. And this increase in the international price of oil transformed the finances of Algeria, which had long been heavily dependent on the country's extensive oil and particularly gas resources. So this was a game changer economically and financially for Algeria. Now, collectively, these 3 developments, the election of Bouteflika, the decline in violence, and the significant rise in the international price of oil, allowed Algeria to make something of a break with the turmoil of the previous decades, which had witnessed financial crisis, uncertain and changing political leadership, and most prominent of all, the very bitter conflict of the 1990s that had cost tens of thousands of lives, according to official figures, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of lives. So therefore, I really wanted this book to be both an account and an analysis of this reconfigured political landscape that comes into view, comes into shape in the early 2000s. So to this end, but 3 early chapters in the book are dedicated to these themes of change leadership, economics, and the decline of the armed conflict. Chapter 2 of the book looks at elite politics, examining the impact of President Bouteflika's presidency from 1999, his battles to assert himself against the leadership of the Algerian military and security services. Chapter 3 examines the decline that occurred in the 2000, the level of violence associated with the civil conflict of the 1990s. It shows how a ceasefire and amnesty were negotiated with the less extreme of the armed groups. It explains the initiatives taken by Bouteflika to bring an end to the conflict through the granting of these amnesties to the armed groups and also legal protection to members of the army and security services. This was fundamentally the deal that was done. And then chapter 4 addresses how the steady rise in the international oil price affected Algerian politics, not only through providing the state with resources to rebuild the country and to dampen opposition, but also how it drew in a new class of businessmen into elite circles in Algeria and deepened institutional corruption. And with this institutional corruption becoming a major feature of this period. As more money came into the system, corruption went up exponentially. Now, the relevance of understanding this period was sort of further sharpened, in my view, by marked changes that came towards the middle of the second decade of the new millennium, about 15 years, 14, 15 years into the 2000s, roughly about 8 or 9 years ago, things began to change. And these changes happened in 2 of the 3 defining features that I have just set out. Now, the first of these changes came in the field of leadership. In April 2013, President Bouteflika suffered a major stroke, which, coming on top of already declining health since 2005, physically incapacitated him as president to the point that he was rarely seen in public thereafter. Now, despite official assertions that he retained his mental faculties, his physical decline and advancing age, when he did appear in public, he looked glassy-eyed and slumped in his chair, indicated that his presidency was approaching its end, despite his securing of a 4th 5-year term in office in 2014. The second thing that had changed by the middle decade of the 21st century, and of much more long-term consequence, was the fall in the international price of oil that occurred from the latter part of 2014. In fact, it lost more than 70% of its value in just 18 months. And given how dependent Algeria was, this had a huge potential impact. Now, although the long years of high prices meant that Algeria had a sizable financial cushion, you really didn't need to be an economist to see that in continuing with existing patterns of consumption and public spending, Algeria would eat through its reserves in just a few short years. For example, it was estimated that Algeria needed oil price of over $100 a barrel, and it went down, I think, at one stage to below $30 a barrel. Now, this placed a huge dark cloud over not just Algerian state finances, but also future social and political stability. Over the previous decade and a half, there had been vast increase in state spending on salaries, on job creation, on housing and infrastructure, funded by the huge increase in revenues from the high oil and gas prices. Now, these had made a significant contribution to the improved social and political peace and stability Algeria had clearly enjoyed over the period. And the scaling back of such spending stood to potentially reverse these effects. Furthermore, I think there were even fears that the financial crisis that seemed to be looming might undermine the status of the third development that had marked the beginning and course of the Bouteflika presidency, that in the decline in the levels of violence. Now, this was because state spending had played a clear role, directly and indirectly, in securing the ceasefire of members of the armed Islamist groups who'd called a ceasefire and taken the amnesty. Generous official financial compensation had also helped soothe the anger and resentment of victims and their families on all sides of the conflict. So there's been a lot of compensation being given out. Therefore, some resurgence in the animosities that had caused the conflict and resulted from it could not really be dismissed with this ending of the sort of palliative state aid, especially given that there had been no systematic public recognition and accounting of the conflict ever occurred. There was no truth and reconciliation process. There was no public accounting like you see in other conflicts. Basically, there had been the various participants had been paid off with the large amounts of money that had come out from the high oil and gas prices. And really, it was then decided that this shouldn't be discussed. So given this, the purpose, therefore, this book, when I began research for it in about 2015, was to attempt to not only explain and account for the preceding period, but also develop some perspective on what the consequences of the new shifts would be. By the time the first draft of this book was finished in late 2018, no real major shifts sort of were yet detectable in the Algerian political landscape. Bouteflika was still alive and president, though he was rarely seen in public and increasingly represented at state events by a giant framed photograph of himself in younger days, something that many Algerians felt insulted by and led them to question who was actually running the country. They said, are we North Korea? But we have pictures of our leader, but we can't even appear in public. And Algerians were increasingly unhappy about this. Social and political peace and stability seemed to be holding, but the sense of political drift, absent leadership and impending financial crisis indicated that perhaps this peace would begin to fray, this sort of arrangement that had been settled in the first decade and a half of the 21st century. The weakness of both formal political opposition in the political parties and organized civil society, something that I explain in chapter 5 of the book, indicated that these things would be unable to marshal and channel the popular unhappiness and anger that would inevitably develop, especially when the financial crisis came to be felt. So the political parties, organizations just weren't strong enough and organized enough to be able to organize this political opposition and unhappiness of the regime. And if it seemed likely then that this discontent would manifest itself in unstructured, even anarchic, and increasingly violent ways, starting locally. And this is a pattern that had already been developing across the country at low levels, that there'd been a lot of locally based unrest in the country. And it seemed that this might be the pattern as things began to come apart, certainly financially. Now, popular unhappiness with the situation, with the drift, with the gloomy economic crisis, the absence of Bouteflika, growing corruption, did begin to express itself, but somewhat earlier than expected, and in a way that really few had foreseen or predicted. This was quite unexpected. And this was the emergence and flourishing of mass protests across the country in late February 29 that seemed to take pretty well everybody by surprise. This was not predicted or foreseen. Now, the protests were specifically sparked by the announcement on the 10th of February that President Bouteflika would seek a 5th consecutive 5-year term in office. What were initially local protests rapidly grew, culminating in thousands coming onto the streets of Algiers on Friday, the 22nd of February. The protests quickly settled into a weekly rhythm of mass protests every Friday, and was soon attracting hundreds of thousands of participants across Algeria. The organization of these events came not from the opposition parties or associations, but rather initially through social media, before developing their own structures and links through the weekly protests themselves. Largely leaderless, they drew support from across the ideological spectrum. Their central demands, expressed unambiguously through banners and chanted slogans, were first for the departure of Bouteflika, and then the removal of the wider political leadership and reform of the whole political system. Pressure from this protest movement, which soon became known as the Hirak Movement in Arabic, led to Bouteflika's resignation as president, and then the dismissal and frequently the arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment of most of his key supporters and ministers over months that followed. Now, even more astonishing to outside observers in particular was the near complete absence of any violence from the protests, despite their enormous size and great diversity. And indeed, the diverse, peaceful, and civic-minded character of the protests evoked unavoidable parallels with the early days of the mass protest movements that had flourished elsewhere across the Middle East and North Africa 8 years earlier, in 2011, in what became known as the Arab Spring or Arab uprisings, but which had, interestingly, had very little echo in Algeria at the time. However, Algeria's movement soon distinguished itself from the other earlier movements in the region by sustaining these trends over the weeks and months and eventually years that followed. Such an achievement was remarkable in its own right, but was of special note in a country that was widely known, certainly outside the country, for a recent history marked by violence and bloodshed. Such a history encompassed not just the painful period of the civil conflict of the 1990s, but also the long struggle for independence from France. Now, this had led to a widespread trend in many journalistic, and I'm ashamed to say even academic narratives of Algerian history, as one that was sort of characterized by nearly unremitting bloodletting and conflict, and that this had consequently created a population in Algeria that was somehow inherently predisposed to acts of violence when confronted with political crises and problems. That somehow Algeria was just naturally violent because of its history. Now, such narratives not only ignore the very particular and different context of the 1990s and 1950s, but also portray a really quite, I think, dubious stereotyping and essentializing of a whole society. And in fact, the enduringly peaceful nature of a protest movement, it was quite remarkable, the lack of violence that occurred, that emerged in 2019 showed how flawed these narratives of sort of ingrained violence were. And moreover, it was no accident or coincidence, but rather an undeniably explicit and conscious choice of those participating in the marches, who made the peaceful nature of their protests one of their two defining features, alongside the commitment to continue the protests. Now, I think the conscious choice of the participants in the Hirak movement to actively reject and move away from a past experience that had been widely assumed to somehow have defined them confirmed their power and agency in the face of historical legacies they were supposedly powerless to resist. Indeed, the enduring commitment to fully peaceful protest became a badge of honor for the movement. In fact, Algerians' bitter experience of bloodshed and turmoil, rather than making them more prone to repeat it, had created a resolve to avoid it at all costs. And I think that's a conclusion that really should not be so surprising, that what people who have suffered violence would want to do anything to avoid it. Now, the Hirak was able to sustain its weekly mass protests for over a year and only suspended them voluntarily in March 2020 with the arrival of the COVID pandemic. They were successfully revived in February 2021, but by the spring, they had been obliged to suspend them once again in response to a renewed surge in the pandemic, but also due to pressure from the authorities. A campaign of arrests, intimidation, and repression of leading activists, together with a huge police presence on the streets of Algeria's main cities each Friday was the day that they used to have the weekly marches, has ensured that so far the Hirak has been unable to revive itself for a third time. What happens next in Algeria is beyond the scope of my book, but what I can do is give some pointers based on what I learned through writing this book about Algeria and its politics. The first point, I think, is the remarkable resilience of the regime and political system in Algeria, surviving a series of serious challenges to its establishment in the wake of a departure of the French in 1962, through the upheaval of the 80s, 90s, the civil war, changes in the price of oil, and then now the Hirak. Now, one of the facets of this, and part of the explanation for it, is the ability to change the regime's senior personnel, including those at the very top, with minimal impact on the structures and exercise of power. The Hirak movement, for example, was able to secure the departure of President Bouteflika in 2019, followed by most of the senior figures in his regime. Everybody who was pretty well anyone was removed, who'd been in place those 2 decades. However, these figures were swiftly replaced from within the system with hardly a perceptible ripple in the control and operation of the system. And the new, in reality, recycled figures who have now assumed the formal positions of power in the system show no real intent to replace or meaningfully reform what is really an opaque and sclerotic power structures that they have inherited and which have become an established feature of the Algerian political system. In my view, and I set this out in chapter 2 of the book, this phenomenon illustrates one of the characteristic features of Algeria's political elite, the lack of importance of individual leaders. In contrast to much of the rest of the Arab world, power just seems not to reside in a few specific, sometimes individual hands, but in a set of institutional actors that change their leading figures with seeming ease. These institutions include the army, the intelligence services, the administration, but without one institution ever predominating for any sustained period. There's been a lot of analysis saying, oh, the army run Algeria, no, the security service, no, the presidency runs it. But each has come and fallen by the wayside at different times and regained. And I think this has resulted in what one observer, Thomas Serres, has called a sort of cartel arrangement, which I think makes a lot of sense about how elite politics work. However, despite this persistence, I think these structures are profoundly unsuited and unprepared to deal with the future challenges that Algeria faces. And we've begun to see this with COVID. We began to see it with the price of oil, gas falling off until the recent rise. Now, I think the emergence in consequences of these challenges strongly suggests that even though the Hirak movement ultimately seems to have been defeated by the state, other popular movements will take its place. I had an Algerian friend of mine recently say to me, the Hirak is not a thing, it's an idea, and the idea is still there. The movement there, the manifestation of the movement, the idea is strongly there. And I think as Algerians seek to secure not just a better leadership of the state and a better life for themselves, but one they fervently believe is owed to them after the sacrifices of the anti-colonial struggle of the 1950s and 60s and the horrors of the civil conflict of the 1990s. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that really really comprehensive and insightful presentation. I think I can speak for most people, or a lot of people here at least, that we've learned a great deal from what you've just said. Please continue to put your questions in the chat so we can put them to Michael. But just I suppose a question from me first, in terms of, how does the independent struggle continue to shape Algerian identity and politics? I'd be really interested to hear your views on that.
Well, as anybody knows, Algeria, the independence struggle is hugely important in Algeria. In many ways, the struggle created the modern Algerian state. So it's very present, and it was evoked certainly in the protests. There was accusations that the government was still dominated by France. It was way too close to France. And also the struggle, the view that Algeria had still not quite won its independence, that the ordinary people didn't have control over Algeria. It was run by this really unaccountable elite at the top. The trouble is that the regime uses the same discourse back against the population. So they were saying, oh, all these people coming out onto the streets, they're basically French agents or agents of unfriendly powers. They're dividing Algeria, they're weakening Algeria. And the protesters pushed back all the way, saying, well, actually, we're still control. We have no control. You are the people who are actually recreating the colonial situation by the lack of democracy and the lack of involvement of the ordinary population and the lack of representation. So it's still very much there.
Thank you very much for that. And just a reminder to everybody that if somebody can probably put it in the chat, that you can purchase Michael's book if you are interested. I would recommend everyone to do so. It's published by Hearst Publishers. Question from Ali Bayhajoub. Ali, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Ali. Good to see you.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I'd like to ask you, would the Hirak have led to a more democratic Algeria had it not been stopped by the pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I think these things are very difficult to tell. We've sort of seen with the events of the Arab Spring that these things are very difficult to run through. All you can see is that if you look at what the banners in the protests were calling for, they were calling for a more representative government. They wanted the constitution changed so that the people had a greater role in it. They wanted the articles of the constitution, I think it's Article 7 and 8, to be introduced that were made things much more accountable. There were large calls for a democratic system. And that is backed up by the survey evidence available. But in the run up to 2019, record numbers of Algerians were responding. They wanted to create a democratic system. Democratic, not just in terms of having proper elections and accountability, but also a form of social justice. That things would be a much more, Algeria's become a more unequal society. And they saw that as very important. How you get there, how you get from a mass movement to creating democracy is very difficult. There are discussions about, there were different views on it. But basically, the authorities in Algeria were able to outmaneuver and snuff that out, unfortunately, so we don't quite know. But certainly we have a very undemocratic and very unrepresentative political system at the moment. So there is likely whatever had been in place would have been an improvement.
Thank you.
Okay, now we have a question from Yasmin Hasnawi.
Hi.
Hello, Yasmin.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for
you?
the very interesting presentation. I was looking forward to listening to the outcome of your book. Now, very briefly, and from your own perspective and research, do you think that Algeria still needs to change within the system in order to get out from from how you put it, from its secularistic power. The second question is at the international level now, and in terms of foreign policy, what we see now happening within the region is that the Maghreb is not united because of, because Algeria has got issues with some countries, with its neighboring countries, because again of a regime that has been existing for so many years. Do you think that these things can change, or do you think that the people are able to change what is happening now in terms of the regime? Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. The system needs changing. How that goes about it, it's one of the difficulties, and I put my hand up in writing the book, is it's very difficult to find out how exactly the system works inside. It is the word that's often used for the Algerian system is opaque, and sometimes I've tried to avoid using a rather cliched view. It is noticeable that opaque is the word that's often used for the Algerian system, and virtually most of the certainly journalistic accounts of Algerian politics usually use the word secret in the title, the secret history of this, the secret of the Algerian regime. So we don't quite know how things operate, but it needs to be able to reform. It won't deal, as I said, with the system, the problems that are coming up. It was able to reconstitute itself, but it's not offering any new problems. I don't see change really coming from within, because it seems that, as I said, if you look at Algeria, isn't a history of, like you get in other countries, of decades and decades of one person dominating, and then when that person goes, that opens things up. We've seen regular changes at the top of the Algerian state with virtually no ripple of change in the system. But individuals departing doesn't seem to make a difference. Therefore, we need to somehow change the institutions. How you go about that is very difficult. I think making a more representative political system, that people with elections that actually count for something, that are run properly, that are representative, that have real, political parties that have support in, I think would be a start. There was discussion in 2019 of some sort of constituent assembly, following the model of something like Tunisia in 2011. Might be a way forward, but it's difficult to see whether there will be change within the system, because we're not quite sure what's happening in the upper echelons, but it seems to be able to replace and revive itself internally without any problems at all, which is quite an unusual feature. On the question of the regional situation, sorry, can you say your question again, Yasmin?
I said, like at the regional, at the international level, now we see that there is no Maghreb, there is no Maghreb unity, because it comes from Algeria and other neighboring countries, and everyone says that there might be a change one day in order to have this unity. Do you think again that something can happen because of an artificial conflict that actually has Morocco and Algeria been in this conflict for so many years, and which doesn't help a Maghreb unity because of two systems, one regime and another country?
Yes, I think you put your finger that the issue is the Western Sahara conflict. The two biggest countries in the region, and the most important, Morocco and Algeria, have completely opposite views on how this conflict should be solved. Morocco believes that the Western Sahara should be fully integrated in the Moroccan state, and Algeria thinks it should be given to the Polisario Liberation Movement to create its own state. And until that problem is reconciled, and I can't see it as being reconciled, Morocco regards it as the number one priority and will accept nothing, certainly from what we see, will accept nothing than complete integration of Western Sahara. Algeria won't accept that, and that's always going to put limits on the relationship. Elsewhere in the region, Tunisia is smaller. Tunisia was one of the states that was always more keen on regional integration. It's taken a rather undemocratic and slightly strange turn under President Kais Saied, so I'm not terribly hopeful there. And Libya, of course, has its own set of problems, so I can't see any progress on that at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also, so I'm reading out now a question from Paul Raymond. He put in his question, said, as you say, the regime has proved remarkably resilient, but to this day, it is still mostly dominated by independence era figures. How will it navigate its way to a younger leadership?
Thank you, Paul, for question. Well, there's some interesting things if you look at the generational issue. I mean, sometimes a bit too much has been made of a generational issue. That really, they said, some people pointed out, for example, with Bouteflika ending his presidency, and then the head of the army, Ahmed Gaid Salah, dying within those things happening within a year itself. But this was sort of the end of a revolutionary generation, and that somehow this would change things. But what you've really got is this sort of interim generation, the sort of second generation. The Algerian sociologist Nasser Jabi writes very, very interesting things about these generational politics. But where you were seeing the second generation, not the generation that actually fought the liberation struggle, but the one that came directly after that. And Nasser Jabi, hope I'm not mischaracterizing what he said, says really you've now got a conflict between this second generation and the third emerged generation that sort of grew up in the 80s and 90s, but is really very unhappy with the situation and with lot and what Algeria has failed to become, and has expressed itself through, for example, the Islamist movement in the 80s and 90s, then through the Civil War, then through other movements in Kabylie, then again through the Hirak. But this is trying to get itself heard. Well, this second generation is rather unwilling to give way. How that happens, and demographically, certainly the younger generations of the vast majority of the population. I think if we look now, I think I'm right in saying that 90%, nearly 90% of the population was born after Algeria got its independence in 1962. I think that does change, but if the people coming up, the new generation, come up through the system like the previous generation, you may not get significant changes.
Thank you, Michael. Question now from Daniel Zeisenwein. Daniel, are you there?
Hi, Danny. How are you?
Hi, Michael. Always a pleasure
Good to see you
and hear you. Maybe just two quick questions. Could you maybe say a few words about how the recent interest in Algeria as a producer and exporter of natural gas, what is that doing to the regime? Is it sort of a short-term vaccine, or do you think it might have a more profound impact? And I can't also resist a quick one also. Where are the Amazigh in all this?
Thank you, Danny. On the first question, Algeria has substantial, as I mentioned, oil and gas, particularly gas. And as I outlined, and I talk about in the book, that really it's being at the financial crisis hurtling towards it as it runs out of the receipts from that, but it was getting to that and relying on. It was a really looming crisis that was going to hit within the next couple of years. Of course, with the significant rise in the international price of oil that occurred from about a year ago, this has substantially eased things for Algeria. Certainly the receipts are up. It has more money in the coffers. Suddenly, international energy is a big issue. It's enjoyed particularly European leaders coming over to try and do deals on gas as problems with Russia, with the high prices. So Algeria feels it's bought itself a little bit of time. But in the long run, I'm not so sure. Algeria hasn't been able to expand much of its gas, and it can demand higher prices, but it hasn't been able to expand its production, mainly problems because of long-term underinvestment. The exploration hasn't really only recently begun to get going again. It also has the problem of many oil producers, and in that sense, it's like the Gulf states. It's starting to consume most of what it actually produces domestically. So what it can export shrinks, and that's creating problems that by some estimates, it will start just consuming everything it produces within perhaps even the next 10, 15 years. That, together with the fact that there's the global move away from fossil fuels, I think presents long-term problems for Algeria. So I think it's bought itself short-term. It has begun to increase things like salaries, pensions, etc., to try and stave off the effects of domestic inflation. But I think it's just bought itself some time but the same problems are not just going to come back again, but far worse given long-term trends. And on the issue of the Amazigh, I suppose it depends which Amazigh you're talking about, Danny. I devote one chapter in the book. I wanted to do something in the book on local politics, and it really was not really possible for some practical reasons to do a sort of thorough examination of how politics works at the local level in terms of local government, etc., across Algeria. But what I did as one way of looking at that was, there's a chapter, I think it's chapter 7, I look at 3 very distinct regions of Algeria that saw significant political upheaval during this period. I look at the Zab Valley, I look at the Saharan South generally, and of course, the most obvious one, I look at Kabylia. And I look at the upheaval in Kabylia and why the Kabyle region, this mainly Berber-speaking region to the east of Algiers, has really taken a rather different trajectory. It had its own protest movement, grew up in 2001. The state was able to defeat and head that off. And interesting enough, you see a lot of the activists from 2001 very prominent in the protests in 2019. And in Kabylia, the biggest demonstrations and the most ones that were able to survive the longest continued in Kabylia. But the interesting thing is it's not really about Berber identity. It's not about language and identity so much. Those things have really been granted by the Algerian state. Certainly formally, there is the old demands of the use of Berber language in the media, in education, have been granted, and also technically in the last constitutional revision, or second but last constitutional revision, Tamazight has been given official status, effectively alongside Arabic. The reality of that is a little bit more complicated, as I think you know. But what the real issue, I think, in Kabylie, and well, Kabyles think, is that they are spearheading change for Algeria. And one of the things that I look at in these 3 regions is they have a problematic relationship with the center of Algeria, but virtually nobody in those regions, there's some small groups, demand to be separate from Algeria. What they all say is the Algerian state, we are Algerians and we are owed more by the central state and we want to be more integrated. And in the overwhelming view in Kabylia is a fact that we are part of the Algerian state, and that we are here to spearhead change for the whole of Algeria. We are here for the whole of Algeria. So it wasn't a separatist thing, and that is certainly the case in the Zab and in the Saharan South, which is quite an unusual feature of Algeria. But people, again, I think this goes back to the liberation struggle. All the Algerians, even these very distinct regions, feel themselves to be part of Algeria, and that they belong to Algeria, and that Algeria belongs to them. And that's a very big theme in Algeria. Algerians feel the country belongs to them. And that's why they feel they won't want to succeed. So that's a rather long way of answering your question, Danny. I hope that helps.
Thank you. That was excellent.
And now a question from Bruce Stanley. Bruce, are you there?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Michael. Nice presentation. Appreciate it. I'm wondering about the existential crisis of climate change and anthropogenic forcing, and how that might differentially affect Algeria, given your comments about the funding ups and downs available to the state and the nature of a weak regime. And in particular, whether particular cities across the country are differentially affected. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I have to admit to that this isn't something I've studied in detail, and I don't really cover in the book. But I think Algeria is facing significant problems, and isn't the fact that it is a major fossil fuels producer already creates those sort of problems. I think it has the capacity for producing more sustainable energy. I don't know. I think I saw there was a very, very good paper written by Andrew Ferrand. I don't know if he's on this call. I really recommend anybody look at it who looks at particularly this issue, and looks at what the possibilities are. For example, in things like harnessing sunlight, wind power, various things like that. But Algeria really hasn't done anything on that. It's way too reliant on fossil fuels. So I'll direct you to that paper rather than exposing any more of my ignorance on this particular topic, Bruce.
And a question now from Rupert Joy.
Hello, Rupert.
Hello, Mike. Very nice to see you, and fascinating as ever to hear your account of this extraordinary country, which I agree with you. I mean, I really like what you said at the beginning. It's always been a mystery to me that Algeria and the region more generally is so little known in the Anglo-Saxon world. I guess I have one quite sort of specific question and one sort of rather vague, unresolved issue in my head. So the specific question is, to what extent you think Algeria has lost influence in recent years in sub-Saharan Africa, which was, for many years such an important part of Algerian identity and the way it sort of saw itself in the world. And the second thing, which is kind of related, is a sort of half article I saw of, I don't know what kind of, how sort of serious, how seriously researched it is, suggesting that Algeria was one of a number of countries that had applied or might apply to join the BRICS bloc, and that this was something that had been very much trumpeted by Sergei Lavrov in the light of the Algerian conflict. So I'm not sure what my question is in the second context, but whether we might be seeing some kind of, related to the whole Ukrainian conflict, we might be seeing some kind of recasting of the strategic situation in the region. But it's a half thought, really.
No, that sounds like a full thought to me, Rupert. Thank you. So yes. Yes, on the first of the question, influence in Africa. Yes, I mean, after independence, Algeria had a lot of kudos and a lot of respect in Africa because it had really fought the longest struggle against European colonial rule. So it came out with a lot of respect and a lot of prestige from that. And Algeria really, in the 60s and 70s, presented itself as something of a leader in the African continent, getting involved in a lot of African initiatives in the 60s and 70s. But really, the internal problems of the 80s and 90s, Algeria loses its way and sort of turns inward because it just has to deal with these crises. The financial crisis of the 80s, with the collapse of the price of oil, which again pushed it into that crisis of that period, and then the conflict of the 1990s. Now, as things improve, as I say, in the 2000s, Algeria starts showing a lot more interest in Africa, and it sort of revives a lot of its old diplomacy. It gets involved in places like Mali, in the Great Lakes region between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and a very old and very noble and very respected tradition is of Algerian mediation, and Algeria sort of revived itself in the 2000s to some degree and got involved in that. Things have got a bit more complicated because another of Algeria's neighbours and rivals, Morocco, has become a lot more interested and engaged in Africa within the last 10 years. And therefore, Algeria has sought to sort of try and counter Moroccan influence. Algeria is of the view, it's probably reasonably well founded, but Morocco's interest in Africa, one of the main reasons, is to try and get the Polisario state in exile, the Sahara Democratic Republic, pushed out of the African Union. And this is Algeria's trying to fight back against that. It has its own interests in Africa. It's suspicious of Morocco's activities. It sees that Morocco is really interested in Western Sahara. It's not terribly interested in Africa. That may or may not be true, but it's trying to revive itself. It certainly has the diplomatic experience. The current, I think he's still currently the Foreign Minister Lamamra was very involved in African institutions in the African Union, knows Africa very well. So Algeria remains quite respected and has been quite active in mediation. So it is reviving itself. It's having this slight quiet duel for influence with Morocco in the region. So it has come back to a certain degree. And I talk a little bit about that in the book. The 8th chapter deals with the international relations, where I try and juggle how these things come back together, particularly as Algeria is able to reassert itself in the 2000s. On your second one on the BRICS, yes, that's an interesting question. I think it's Algeria trying to try and assert itself. There is the whole very complicated issue of Algeria's relationship with Russia. Algeria's always had fairly good relations with Russia. And a lot of people, and it's been traditionally been one of the main purchasers of Russian arms. And when the oil price increased and finances improved dramatically in the early 2000s, I spoke about, a lot of money was spent by Algeria in rebuilding and expanding its military. And its main source for its military came from Russia, and ties developed there with Russia. Now, up until a year ago, that wasn't terribly controversial, but of course that is hugely controversial now, this relationship with Russia. And I see that both members of the US Congress and the European Parliament are actually proposing that there be sanctions on Algeria because of its closeness to Russia. And relations have been pretty good. The Russians, Algeria, when Russia went into Ukraine in 2014, Algeria didn't condemn it and didn't vote a motion of censure, and again abstained in March after Russia tried to invade the rest of Ukraine, and abstained on the condemnation in October of Russia annexing 4 provinces of Ukraine. Now, that is not to say at all that Russia is somehow some sort of pawn or tool of Russia. One very important thing to know about Algeria, its experiences of the colonial period mean that it is extraordinarily reluctant to make itself beholden to any other country, including close allies like Russia. The Russians have, for example, regularly pushed to try and get some base on the Algerian coast, and the Algerians have always refused. They like the closeness of a relationship, but they don't certainly want to be controlled or under undue influence from Russia. That said, the current environment is changing. Algeria has been unusually supportive. I believe there were the first ever joint military maneuvers between Russia and Algeria, but that has to be seen in the context of Algerian concerns about what has been happening in Algeria, particularly Algeria's normalization of relationships with Israel and its growing and its continuing relationship with America. But Algeria clearly feels threatened by those developments. So there's a little bit of that going on as well. Russia was one of the few countries that did not comment and was actually quite supportive in 2019 when the protests began. So that relationship is still there, and presumably BRICS is part of that. I don't know whether it will become a BARICS or a BRICSA or an ABRICS. I don't know where the Algerians see them fitting in, but it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting idea, probably for the Algerians to try and raise their profile a little bit. So I don't know if that answers your question at all.
There's also a question actually on BRICS from Nassima Negaz, who sort of asks, what are the short and the long-term implications of Algeria applying to join BRICS, which I think you've covered some of them, but perhaps.
Thank you, Nassima. Nice to see you, Nassima.
Also, so a question also from Hamid Salah said, don't you think that the same regime that was able to keep the balance in the region and to fight against terrorism, terrorist risks after the fall of the Libyan regime, and that is a stabilizing factor in the region?
Yeah, yes, I think I do. I mean, despite the problems I see in the way that Algeria has been run internally, which we see manifest by the fact that large numbers of the population come onto the street to protest it. If you look at Algeria's behavior and actions internationally, it's actually been a force for stability and a very positive force in the region. In 2011, things changed dramatically with what we call the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings, with the fall of the regimes in Libya and in Tunisia on the eastern border, chaos in Mali. And Algeria has played a very careful, mediated and measured role in trying to mediate and trying to reduce those conflicts, and has actually played a very positive role. And I think that is appreciated in somewhere like, particularly in the US and other places. And I think that's why there hasn't been as much international pressure in Algeria, because it's seen as a source of stability in the region. And in terms of its foreign policy, I think it's been had a very positive influence. But of course, if the domestic situation could threaten that. But in that sense, that's the sort of one of the strange things. And in the book, I do say that actually it's quite a positive story that Algeria plays internationally, not without its slightly, there are some small things that go on, but generally has helped stabilize Tunisia, has tried to help stabilize Libya, and has certainly been very helpful in Mali in trying to lessen the conflict there.
Thank you very much. And this is I think very the final two questions now. One was another one from Ali Bahajoub, which he asks, why is the military fritting away the oil revenue and purchasing more military hardware when the Algerian people are in need of social and economic development? And also another one from me, I suppose, and just in terms of obviously speaking about the popular movements in Algeria, I'm wondering, how do they manifest themselves amongst like the Algerian diaspora in places like France, in places like the UK and elsewhere?
Thank you. Yes, on Ali's point, yes, I agree with you, Ali. It's that the money would be better spent on the population, but I think it is indicative of how concerned the Algerian military are about threats on its borders, particularly with Morocco. The military have always played a role in the system, so inevitably they're never going to be short of funds because of their significant role as in one of these institutions there. But I agree with you that money would better spend, and I think people are beginning to ask those sort of questions, which could create problems. Although externally, when they're external threats, the population sometimes can be less critical. On the issue of sorry, Joe, remind me of the question again.
There's a question in terms of the popular movements in Algeria and how they manifest themselves among Algerian communities.
Oh, yeah, well, that was something that was quite remarkable in 2019. That that there were protests everywhere where there was a significant Algerian population. There was even one in Trafalgar Square, and I actually happened just to be going to Marseille, and there was huge demonstrations in Marseille as well. And I think the diaspora has always played an important role in Algeria. There's a significant, millions of Algerians live outside the country. It's contributed to the opposition in the past. It's contributed to debate, and I think it will continue to contribute in the future. So this is a country where the diaspora do have an influence significantly on what has happened and are important, and I think they will help organize, and they've certainly helped the idea and even the structures of a Hirak survive outside Algeria, and I think that is an important factor in Algeria.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for your wonderful contribution to this evening, and thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for all of your excellent questions too. We hope you found this really informative as I have done, and one sort of request from us as Caabu is that if you feel willing, please do join us sign up as a member, support our work, help us put on events like this again. We have actually done many events on a variety of issues, obviously including Algeria. I think this is our first online event on Algeria though since we started doing them, and we're very keen to do even more. So please do support us if you can. And thank you again, Michael. It was a really brilliant contribution that you made, and brilliant presentation you made to us this evening. And we're very, very grateful to have you join us.
Thank you, Joe. It was a pleasure, and thank you for all the great work that you do at Caabu. And I would encourage everybody to support Caabu. It's been does some great work. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all very much for attending and the great questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.